Maybe we'll go ahead and begin. Can you hear me okay? Okay, a little low. Okay, I'll try and speak up. Okay. Welcome to Building a Culture in Employee Engagement, Session 16. I'm Roger Gantz. I'm the practice leader for the state practice at CPS, CPS HR Consulting. Most of you know us as CPS. With me today is our principal presenter, Bob Lavigna, who I should probably start off by saying how glad we are that he's here with us today, mainly because yesterday at this time he and Delta Airlines were contending with blizzards and snowstorms in Minnesota and Madison, Wisconsin, and it's great that we were very relieved to have him arrive about midnight last night. So thank you for choosing to spend part of your afternoon with the employee engagement topic. Our principal speaker, Bob, is a recognized thought leader in employee engagement, and specifically in employee engagement in government. He's the author of Engaging Government Employees, which is published by American Management Association, and is the first book to really explore employee engagement in the unique environment of the government. The Governing Magazine calls the book one of the top 6 books that public leaders should read, and a lot of Bob's presentation today will draw from that book. I'll more fully introduce Bob in a moment, but first we thought it might be helpful to just set a brief context for the session today. With today's forum, the overall forum, and those that have gone before it, it's clear that the state of California has fully embraced transformation and innovation. And increasingly, employee engagement is being recognized as for having the relationship it does to increase performance, and because it's just the right business thing to do, but also because it's seen as a critical component, and some would say a prerequisite for effective transformation and innovation. And this is evidenced in the tagline for today's forum: enable, evolve, and engage. The state has taken some important steps toward addressing increased levels of employee engagement, and many of you are probably aware of those, and we just thought it might be good again to set a context that the new state leadership philosophy has as one of its statewide leadership values inspirational engagement. I think most of you are aware that the GovOps agency this past summer spearheaded the first statewide engagement survey, employee engagement survey, came out with some interesting initial findings where generally state employees believe that their work makes a difference in the lives of Californians, and they know what's expected of them on the job. At the same time, they believe management does not recognize good work and does not hold employees accountable for results. So that kind of sets a stage. We understand that the current thinking of GovOps and CalHR is to have that statewide survey administered, to be built upon, and to have it administered at least once every other year. But in the meantime, there's going to be encouragement for departments to be undertaking their own focus surveys and initiating their own employee engagement programs. And there are some good examples. CalSTRS and CalPERS would be 2 of those right now. Our goal with today's session is to make a meaningful contribution toward the state's ability, or toward the state's efforts to increase employee engagement. And in doing so, we will do so by providing managers and leaders with some information that will help them to make the case for increasing engagement, also with some practical guidance on how to build a culture of employee engagement. Bob Lavigna is a member of the CPS family. He has more than 30 years' experience in public sector capital management organizations. Bob is currently the Assistant Vice Chancellor and the Director of HR at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. In addition to having served as a Senior Manager for CPS in our Midwest and Washington, D.C. offices, Bob has served as the Vice President for Research for Partnership for the Public Service, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to revitalizing the public service by inspiring new generations to serve and helping to transform government. Bob served for 10 years as the governor's appointed administrator of the Wisconsin Civil Service. He's a fellow at the National Academy for Public Administration, a past president of IPMA HR, and has been selected an Official of the Year by Governing Magazine. The list goes on, but I'll stop now and hand over to Bob.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.
I'm going to hop down here so I can walk around a little. Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here today. The story, though, as Roger said, my wife, who was traveling with me, had a bit of an adventure yesterday traveling here. So it took us about 15 hours. We started out in Madison, Wisconsin, our home. One snowstorm. Then we flew into another snowstorm in Minneapolis. So we got to the hotel at about midnight last night, went to sleep, got up this morning, and we turned the news on. So we're listening to the national news. I guess Donald Trump wants a do-over in the Iowa caucuses. But I guess that's a different session. So we get to the weather report. We hear the national weather, and then we hear the local weather. And the weather report for Sacramento is rain and some snow. And my wife says, snow? That we didn't come to California for snow. And I said, no. So we're okay. We're not interested in seeing any more snow during this visit. But thanks very much. I'm excited about the topic, building a culture of employee engagement. That's because I believe that the biggest challenge facing public sector organizations, and by that I mean at all levels, federal, state, and local, is attracting, developing, and retaining talent. Now, sometimes when I say that, I get some funny looks and raised eyebrows. And as you heard Roger describe, I've spent most of my 40 years in government, 10 years in state government. So I really appreciate some of the challenges and issues that you face every day when you come to work. But really, we can't get anything done in government. And by government, I include public higher education, because we are all state employees at the University of Wisconsin, unless we have talent, the right people with the right skills in the right places at the right times. And often when I speak at events like this, I like to speak early so I can kind of get that out of the way, and then I can attend sessions for the rest of the day. But I'm really happy that this session is later in the day, because I have an opportunity to sort of reflect on some of the other sessions that I participated in today. And I made a list of some of the issues that I have heard: innovation, risk-taking, transformation, consensus, technology. The augmented reality session at lunchtime today, that was really, really something. Vision and mission, teamwork, citizen engagement, communication, data, leadership, change agents. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that every one of these issues, everything that we've heard about today, involves people. The session that we just had, and I couldn't have said it any better, one of the speakers said, exceptional results. It's all about the people, and it starts with us as leaders. Roger mentioned that I work for the Partnership for Public Service. My boss there, the CEO, likes to say that in government, we spend about 80% of our time developing policies and 20% of our time executing those policies. And he thinks in the private sector, it's the reverse. Private sector companies spend 20% of the time developing policy and 80% of the time implementing those policies. Now, I don't know if the numbers are right, but I agree with the sentiment. We can have the best policies, the best ideas, the best technology, but if we don't have the right people, the best talent that is engaged, we can't be successful. And I know it's becoming more and more difficult to succeed in the public sector, and that includes higher education. We're in the process of figuring out how to swallow a $150 million budget cut across our entire system. Guy that writes for Governing Magazine likes to put it like this. He says, in government, they expect us to do more with less, then even more with even less, and ultimately they want us to do everything with nothing. So an exaggeration, but a little bit of truth, right? And that's why I'm excited about employee engagement, because, and I'll show you some of the data that I think clearly and convincingly show that high engagement organizations in the public and private sectors outperform low engagement organizations. Improving employee engagement can improve individual and organizational performance. And this is not just a conversation that is going on in this room or at this conference or in this state or in this country, but really around the world. And I'll share with you some data from the Deloitte, one of our exhibitors here today, the 2015 Global Human Capital Trends Survey. 3,300 organizations from around the world responded to the survey. 87% believe that the issues of employee engagement and culture are important. And across the 3,300, they identified that as the #1 challenge. So 87% important, 50% very important, 66% reported updating their engagement and retention strategies. So organizations around the world appreciate that this should be a high priority, measuring and improving employee engagement. Another survey here in the US, for 3 years running, more than 80% of all organizations rank employee engagement as one of their key strategic priorities. So I want to take a little poll. I don't have any technology. We're not going to be texting the responses. But I want to get a sense of how many organizations in the room are doing something around employee engagement. So a strategic initiative, some focus on either measuring or improving employee engagement. So let's see. Good. So it looks like the majority are doing something. So I hope what we'll discuss today will help you on the road to improved employee engagement. And those of you who aren't doing anything, I hope you'll hear something that will motivate you to go back to your organizations and begin the conversation. So I want to cover 4 things. What is employee engagement? Let's all get on the same page definitionally. But even more important, why does it matter? What is the business case for improving employee engagement? Why does it matter, and why should we focus on it? Then we'll talk a little bit about measuring engagement. I'll give you a preview right now. I believe, and I think the research shows, that the best way to measure engagement is through employee engagement surveys, asking our employees to tell us how they feel about their jobs, the organization, their supervisors, telling us how they feel, and then doing something with the results. Provide you with some examples of what public sector organizations that have measured engagement have done to improve it, and then talk a little bit about what it means to create a culture of engagement, and how do we know if organizations have achieved an engagement culture. That is, this is the way we do business. This is part of our organizational DNA. We focus on employee engagement. This is how we behave and interact with each other. So this is an image of my book. This is a commercial. I want you to buy it. I also want you to buy multiple copies to share with your colleagues. But beyond that, I just want to mention why I wrote this book, and Roger alluded to this. I wrote it, first of all, because I believe in the power of employee engagement, and I hope I'll show you today why, convincingly. But also, despite everything that has been written and spoken about employee engagement, and if you Google employee engagement, you'll get between 7 and 8 million hits. I hadn't come across anything that really focused on what I believe to be the unique challenges of managing in the public sector. I've operated in both the public and private sectors, and I believe there are differences, and I believe many of those differences actually make it more difficult to manage in government than in the private sector. And I think that has implications for human capital in general, including for employee engagement. So that's the end of the commercial. I want to start by focusing on the key points. I like to sometimes start as well as end with the key points. Employee engagement drives performance and other positive outcomes. And I'll show you quite a bit of data that I think demonstrates that in general, but also particularly in the public sector. Show you some data about the level of employee engagement. It's relatively low, and it's kind of a good news, bad news story, right? We'd like it to be a little higher, but on the other hand, the fact that it's low creates tremendous potential for us to improve engagement and therefore improve organizational performance. We have to measure it. In order to improve something, we have to measure it, right? But if we measure engagement, particularly through an employee survey, if we ask our employees to tell us how they feel, and we don't do anything with the results, we will be worse off than if we'd done nothing. It's not just an initiative or a program. How many of you in the room are involved in human resources in your organizations? Okay. Well, you may not like what I'm going to say, but improving employee engagement cannot be successful if it is just an HR initiative. It has to be part of the strategic direction of the organization. It can't be perceived as another thing that we in HR are doing to the rest of the organization. But we do have an important role, right? We need to be the champions, we need to facilitate the process, and we need to not just tell the rest of the organization what to do, we need to do it ourselves. So those are the key points. Provide you with some context, some data. This is a chart, and you can figure this chart out yourself. It's the distribution of the workforce by age across 4 sectors: federal, state, and local government, and the private sector. And what you can see immediately is in the public sector, on the right side of the chart, age 50 or above, we are older on average in the public sector than in the private sector. On the other end of the chart, we have considerably fewer employees under the age of 30 in the public sector than the private sector does. This chart has many implications for talent management, succession planning, recruiting, knowledge transfer, but it also has implications for employee engagement, because we're going to need to replace these 50-somethings, and I have nothing against 50-somethings. I wish I was still in that category myself. But we're going to need to replace these people, and they are beginning to retire. We've heard about this retirement tsunami for like 10 years, right? Well, it's beginning to happen. And if we want to replace these people, particularly with younger talent, we're going to need to create workplaces that enable our employees to be engaged, to make that commitment, and to have satisfying work experiences. So this is, I think, a powerful chart. So what is engagement? It's about connection between an employee and the job. The head, an intellectual connection, and the heart, an emotional connection. Now, in my career, I've gotten feedback from time to time that I take my work personally, and it hasn't always been positive feedback. But I'd rather have employees who care a little too much sometimes than employees who don't care enough. So it's about that connection, and it really goes beyond job satisfaction. If you spend some time in the employee engagement literature, and I have, there's this sort of ongoing dialogue about whether or not engagement and satisfaction are the same. And I believe that satisfaction is necessary but not sufficient for engagement. We can have employees who are satisfied because we pay them pretty well, they have pretty good benefits, and they have reasonable workloads. And we want people to feel good about those things, but we also want them to take the next step to the next level and be engaged, to have pride in where they work, feel good about their work, feel good about the mission of the organization, feel like the organization values them, and in return, engaged employees will deliver discretionary effort or energy, which means they will go beyond their job description, they will go beyond their normal work hours in order to help the organization achieve its mission. So this is a pretty standard definition, particularly the discretionary effort part, about employee engagement. So as you think about the definition, and you think about your own organizations, you think about yourselves, how do you know if an employee is engaged? What kind of behaviors do they exhibit? And in case you're wondering, this is the audience participation part. And I'm comfortable with silence. Yes, ma'am.
Curiosity.
Curiosity. They're curious. Sir.
They take the initiative.
They take the initiative. They don't just wait. They're not reactive. They're proactive, right? Anyone else? Ma'am.
Passion.
They're passionate. Okay. Somebody else? Yes. They're challenged. And they like being challenged, right? One more? Yes.
Suggestions.
They make suggestions. They do this stuff. And you hit on most of them, volunteer ideas. This one, they'll stay even for less money. There is research that shows that employees who are highly engaged will stay with the organization even if they have opportunities to earn more elsewhere. Of course, there's a limit to how much they'll sacrifice. There's another piece of research that shows that employees are willing to take a pay cut. Many employees are willing to take a pay cut of up to $5,000 if they could just get a new boss. We'll talk about that in a moment. Recommend the organization is a good place to work. This is an important one for a couple of reasons. First of all, we want our employees saying good things about our organizations, right? Because we want to combat this constant barrage of criticism about government. And as we move even further into the political season, we're going to hear more of this stuff. But we also want our employees out there being sort of unofficial recruiters, right? We're going to need to replace the baby boomers. In the private sector, a very common way to hire new employees is through employee referrals. We don't do enough of that in the public sector, and there are reasons for that, civil service and merit and all of that. But we need to rely more on our employees as sources of recruits. So these are the kinds of things that engaged employees do. I'm going to show you some data now from both the private and public sectors about the difference between high engagement and low engagement organizations. But before I show you the data, I want to show you a picture. And it's said that a picture's worth 1,000 words. With me, it's probably like 10,000 words. So why does engagement matter? And when I speak to groups that include public works folks, they really get this. But as far as I know, this is an actual picture of a work product that was done by probably disengaged or disengaged employees. But some real data. This is from Gallup. We know Gallup as the public opinion polling organization, right? But Gallup also has done a tremendous amount of work around employee engagement, has a survey, an engagement survey with 12 questions, which Gallup cleverly calls the Q12. It has been administered to literally millions of employees around the world in thousands of organizations. What you see here is Gallup's analysis of the difference in performance on these key performance indicators between the top quartile of organizations in its database, based on employee engagement scores, and the bottom 25%. So much more profitable, about more than 20% more productive, 10% higher customer scores, less turnover, less absenteeism, and so forth. And what I like about this data set is it's so big, includes private and public sector employees, millions of them. And I also want to point out that this is a comparison of the top 25% with the bottom 25%. If we were looking at the top 10%, top 5%, top 1%, these differences would be even more dramatic. When I was at the Partnership for Public Service, we did a couple of projects with Gallup, and I remember we were in a meeting one time with the Gallup CEO, a guy by the name of Jim Clifton, who was brilliant, although he's a little eccentric, but, and he was telling a story about how Gallup was approached by a major hotel chain. And the hotel chain asked Gallup to do a customer satisfaction survey. And Clifton said, sure, we're happy to do it, we're happy to take your money. But if you really want to get value for your dollar, you will do an employee engagement survey. Because if you have a high level of engagement, all of the other business outcomes that you want to achieve will follow. And I think you wind up doing both. Temkin Group, highly engaged, almost 5 times more committed to success, 2.5 times more likely to recommend improvements, and again, much more likely to recommend their employer as a good place to work. But what about in government? Some great work done in the federal government by the U.S. Merit Systems Protection Board, and you don't have to remember anything about MSPB, except that it reviewed the survey, engagement survey results from around 37,000 federal employees and found that agencies with a high level of engagement almost twice as likely to achieve their strategic goals, higher retention, better attendance, and even fewer equal employment opportunity complaints because people in these organizations treated each other with respect. So that's a public sector database. International Public Management Association for HR. This is state and local government survey. Engaged public sector employees, more likely to stay in their current job, again, recommend their workplaces, and more likely to be highly satisfied. And if we believe that satisfaction is necessary but not sufficient for engagement, this is important data. Deloitte, also public sector, higher levels of engagement linked to important outcomes, performance supporting mission, more collaborative and innovative work environments. We heard several presenters in the last session in this room talk about how we need to create opportunities for our employees to be innovative and collaborative, particularly younger employees, because they're used to collaborating. They want to work in places that allow them to be innovative, and that turns into high engagement organizations. Lower costs of disengagement. Gallup estimates that in just the American economy, disengagement costs between $350 and $450 billion a year, much of that in lost productivity. And just one more, Towers Watson, again, this is a public sector database. Towers Watson surveyed public sector employees, asked them to respond to a bunch of statements. The three you see here are about impacting quality, cost, and customer service. Highly engaged, almost 3 times more likely to agree with these statements. And of course, we want our people to feel like they can influence things like quality, cost, and customer service. 35% of U.S. workers polled say, I mentioned this earlier, they'd willingly forego a substantial pay raise in exchange for seeing their direct supervisor fired. Now, we're not sure if it's that the supervisor gets fired or they actually get to see their supervisor get fired. They're in the room watching that man or woman get fired. So, this is the audience participation part. Given all I've said about how important engagement is, all of the data, and I've only shown you the tip of the iceberg, that demonstrates that engagement leads to good performance outcomes, what do you think the level of engagement is? This is according to Gallup, as you can see. What percent of employees in the American workforce, both public and private, based on Gallup data, do you think are engaged? 0 to 100. 8? This is a pessimist. 33. Okay, we're getting there. 34. We're going to go 1% at a time. I think we're going to be here a long time. 43. Okay, and the answer is 32%. So somebody got it. 51% not engaged and 18% actively disengaged. So fewer than 1 in 3 in the American economy. State and local government, this is based on IPMA AHR. It's a little better. 47% engaged, 53% not engaged. So, but still fewer than 1 in 2 employees engaged. The California survey, random sample of 5,000 employees, on a scale of 1 to 4, the average was about 3. So not terrible, but certainly not great. Much room for improvement. So, as I mentioned earlier, this level of engagement, which is relatively low, it's a good news, bad news story. We want it to be higher, but the fact that it isn't gives us an opportunity to measure and improve engagement and really generate some organizational performance improvement. So how do we know if our employees are engaged? I gave you the answer to this before. Anybody remember? Survey, right. We asked them. And there are many different surveys. I mentioned the Gallup Q12. There are other surveys out there. And what I tell organizations is don't agonize over which questions to ask. If you look at these surveys, they're really all focused on many of the same characteristics. What's really important is to make a commitment to collecting survey data, asking our employees how they feel about their jobs and the organizations and the supervisor, and then, even more important, acting on the data. But I want to show you one survey. This is actually a survey we use at the University of Wisconsin. We borrowed it from the federal government. It includes 16 questions sorted into several categories. You see 2 of the categories: pride in the work or the workplace, satisfaction with leadership. And the satisfaction with leadership, it's not just my direct supervisor, but it's also how I feel about the leaders above my direct supervisor. And you see the 4 questions about pride, including the work I do is meaningful for me. I'm able to make that personal connection. I feel like I can make a difference in this organization. Several questions: an opportunity to perform well. Do I have the resources? People want to perform well. We need to put them in the position to succeed. 2 questions about satisfaction with recognition received. Not just whether or not I feel like I'm getting recognized, but whether I feel like across the entire organization, recognition and rewards are being distributed fairly. And then the last couple of categories: professional and personal growth and positive work environment and teamwork. So using these 16 questions, which are scaled on a 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree, can calculate an engagement index, which is a single number that will tell the organization what the level of engagement is in that organization. So just one example to give you a sense of the kinds of questions that are typically asked in engagement surveys. So how many of you are administering some sort of survey in your organization? Okay, so fewer than the number who are engaged in some sort of initiative, but still a significant number. So as we move towards the end of this very quick trip through the world of employee engagement, I want to give you some examples of what public sector organizations have done after measuring engagement to improve it. And as I said earlier, I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all solution to improving engagement, especially not in the public sector. There are 90,000 public sector organizations and jurisdictions across the country. And I don't think there's any single thing that can improve engagement in all of those organizations. I have a book at home that is almost as good as my book, but not quite, entitled 180 Ways to Improve Engagement. Now, there probably are more than 180 ways to improve engagement, but good luck trying to figure out which of those 180 are going to work in your organization without collecting data on how your employees feel. But it's instructive to understand what particularly government agencies have done. It's a strategy. It's not just an HR program. It's not just something that a leader who read an article or a book feels that he or she ought to implement without really thinking it through. At the university, we have linked our engagement efforts specifically to one of our strategic goals, which is attract and retain talent. And I'll give you an example from another jurisdiction that has done that as well. So it has to be part of the organizational strategy and the values of the agency or unit. It requires leadership. And what does that mean? I'll give you what I think is a really good example. The Patent and Trademark Office several years ago was ranked 176 among all federal agencies in best places to work in the federal government. The commissioner of the PTO decided that that was not good enough, and she made a personal commitment to taking action across the Patent and Trademark Office that would improve and increase the level of engagement. She did a lot of things. She improved communication. She increased the use of flexible work arrangements. She did a lot of work with her managers and supervisors to improve their effectiveness. 5 years later, Patent and Trademark Office was ranked #1 in employee engagement across the entire federal government. Another example, the city of Minneapolis, the mayor served 4 terms, no longer is the mayor. Every time the city did a survey, and they've been doing surveys for 10 or 12 years, he would sit down with each department director and go over the survey results and discuss what the director was going to do with the survey data. And if the survey results were positive, they had one kind of conversation. If the survey results were less positive, they had a little different kind of conversation. But here was someone who was not just talking about it, he was actually doing something about it. Hiring. Bringing people into the organization who can help create a high engagement organization. The Patent and Trademark Office very explicitly in its hiring process, and there are instruments to help you do this, tries to identify those candidates who will come into the organization and help maintain a high level of employee engagement. Onboarding. You only get one chance at a first impression. And if you mess it up, there are going to be consequences. Research shows that improving onboarding improves employee engagement, it improves time to productivity, and it improves retention. And at the university, we define onboarding as the period of time between when a new employee accepts a job offer, even before they show up to work, all the way through that employee's first year. And I'll show you a picture of that model in a moment. So I mentioned the city of Minneapolis. The tagline is a city that works explicitly includes engaged and talented employees that reflect our community as part of its city values. So this, again, an organization that has explicitly included engagement as part of its strategic direction. This is the onboarding model, originally developed, research we did at the Partnership for Public Service. We've adopted it at the university, and it's been adopted by other public sector organizations. I'm not going to go through any kind of detail here, except to mention that we've divided onboarding into several different phases and listed in each one of those phases activities that need to get done. When people join the university, we know that they are ready for the job. We want to make sure that the job is ready for them. And these activities extend throughout the employee's first year to make sure the new employee has the support, the resources, and the knowledge they need to be successful, and to be successful as quickly as possible. Supervision. The MSPB, which I mentioned before, another great piece of research, wanted to find out what differentiated the high engagement agencies in the federal government from the low engagement agencies. And it found that the single biggest differentiator is what you see right here. High engagement agencies managed performance effectively. They did these things, and they did them better than the low engagement agencies. And that goes to an important point. I mentioned leadership before. Oftentimes, the level of engagement comes down to the individual relationship between the manager-supervisor and the employee. Someone wrote once that in the federal government, because there are 2.1 million employees, there are 2.1 million solutions to employee engagement. Now, that's a little overwhelming, but it goes to the point that it's about communication and relationship between the supervisor and the individual employee. And the supervisor, in high engagement organizations, supervisors do these things and they do them well. Some more about management and supervision. We shouldn't be selecting supervisors because they've been around for a long time or because they're good technically. We need to be selecting supervisors who can be good leaders and who can build engagement in their work unit. Developing competencies. We've developed a set of competencies around engagement and inclusion. These are the things we want our managers and supervisors to be good at. We've identified the competencies. We've identified a series of behaviors. We train around these competencies. We're beginning to make hiring advancement decisions on these competencies. We want our managers to incorporate these behaviors into the way they do business day in and day out. Not thinking that engagement is just something you do when you get all your work done. It's an important part of their leadership responsibilities, training, resources, and support, and then holding them accountable for engagement. We drive engagement survey data down to the lowest possible work unit, as long as there are 5 responses. And that's our way of creating actionable data and also holding our managers accountable for not only analyzing the data, but taking action on it. Some more. Connecting work to the mission, making that line of sight explicit between the work I do and the mission of the agency. In the book, there's a great quote, and it goes something like this. A fellow who worked in human services, he says that whenever he gets down about the bureaucracy or the workload or the lack of resources, he goes back and connects with the people he serves, and that reminds him of why he's in that business. Appreciate and recognize. We can't always do that financially in the public sector, but we can do it in other ways. The University of Wisconsin Hospital has put together a guide for its managers and supervisors, and its title is something like Ways You Can Recognize Employees Without Spending a Dime. And sometimes it just means telling people you believe that they have done a good job. Listening. There are great ways that organizations, including in the public sector, are using social media and crowdsourcing approaches to solicit ideas from across their workforce. The Department of Labor and the federal government allows employees to make suggestions, and then the entire department has an opportunity to vote on those suggestions, and any suggestion that receives 150 votes automatically goes to senior leadership for a decision. So sort of the 21st century suggestion box. Empower, the word has become almost a cliche, but we heard a session. How many of you went to the risk-taking session earlier today? Empowering employees also means letting them take risks and protecting them, making them feel safe that even if they take a risk and it fails, they're going to be okay. Now, I know, I've been in government for a long time. I know that if we fail in government, the risk is that we'll be reading about it the next day in the Sacramento Bee above the fold, right? But nevertheless, we need to enable our employees to take risks. There's a quote from Harvard Business Review. The wisdom of learning from failure is incontrovertible, yet organizations that do this well are rare. And I think that's even truer in the public sector. Respecting work-life balance, employees who are able to take advantage of workplace flexibilities have a higher level of engagement than those who don't. Now, that doesn't always mean work at home, right? When we talk about flexibilities, everybody wants to work at home. Well, everybody can't work at home. But there are other ways that we can allow people to have a positive experience at work, but also go home and have a rewarding personal life. And then communicate. One of the things that we've done at the university, we have a lot of second and third shift folks. And for a long time, they have been underserved and underappreciated. And they told us through the survey that they really don't understand what's going on in the rest of the university. They don't get enough information. Most of them don't have regular access to computers. They're custodians. They take care of our research animals, jobs like that. So we began holding HR forums. We do them every quarter. We do 2 in the daytime, and we do 1 at midnight for the second and third shift employees. And I hate the ones at midnight because I don't like to stay up that late. But they love it. We get a better attendance at the midnight sessions than we do at the daytime session. We got the Chancellor to show up, and for many of them, it was the first time the employees had ever had direct contact with the Chancellor. They described it as historic, and they treated her like a rock star. So it was a win-win. So there's a story to go back to this connection between the work I do and the mission of the agency. There's a story, maybe apocryphal, but it's one of those stories that if it's not true, it ought to be. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, the president reportedly visited NASA one time, walking down the hallway, saw a custodian, who I guess had been screened by the Secret Service, went up to the custodian and said, what is it you do? What is your job? And the custodian responded, I help send men to the moon. At that time, it was all men. So this is the kind of connection that we would all hope that our employees have, right? They know not just what they do in their jobs, but they know how that connects to the mission of the agency. So the last couple of slides, I mentioned engagement culture. We at the university have been involved in a public-private consortium called the Engagement Institute, sponsored by the Conference Board. We get together periodically, and we also do research. The first piece of research that the Institute did was around a culture of engagement. Defining a culture of engagement, and you see the definition we came up with here, engagement is a cultural norm, and then identifying what it is about high engagement organizations that have enabled them to create a culture of engagement. And these are the characteristics of organizations that have been able to create a culture of engagement. And a lot of the things that I've talked about already linked to mission, critical business outcome, leader managers work together to drive engagement. But this link to mission and critical business outcomes, we don't just want to improve engagement for the sake of improving engagement, right? We want to improve engagement because it has business outcomes. In the private sector, a ton of research, and I showed you some of it, high engagement firms outperform low engagement firms in financial measures like revenue, profit, earnings per share, stock prices, and so on. It's a lot more difficult for us in the public sector, in higher education as well, to measure our outcomes, right? But there are some great examples. I'll go back to the Patent and Trademark Office. During the time that the PTO went from being ranked 176 in best places to work in the federal government to number 1, the office dramatically decreased the backlog of patent applications. And that is a critical business indicator because it has implications for the entire economy if the Patent and Trademark Office is not able to promptly and quickly approve patent applications. So a critical business indicator, at the same time engagement went up, so did, the backlog actually went down. In my organization, Office of Human Resources, one of our business units had the highest increase in employee engagement. At the same time, it had the highest increase in customer satisfaction scores. Now, can I say statistically there's cause and effect? No, but we sure like the outcome. So I'm often asked, how do I get started as an organization? I think you have to make the commitment. I think you have to communicate the business case, particularly to frontline managers and supervisors, as well as rank and file employees, so everyone understands we're not just doing this as another exercise. We're doing this because we believe it can make a difference in how we perform and how we serve our citizens. Mention that. Involved labor. I haven't talked too much about that, but there are some great examples of public sector organizations that have gotten organized labor involved at the front end of the process, made them allies in the process, convinced labor that this was an important opportunity for their members to express their views and opinions to senior leadership. Now, there are some also terrible examples where public sector agencies have not done that. One of them is the United States Postal Service, which conducts quarterly employee engagement surveys. Every quarter, it surveys 25% of the workforce. So every year, it surveys the whole workforce. It did not involve labor unions initially, and labor unions actually called for their employees to boycott the survey because the unions felt that management would misuse and misrepresent the survey data. So get labor involved early. Plan and communicate what you're going to be doing. Make sure the entire organization understands what's going to happen, what you're going to do, and then share the results. Be transparent about it. If we ask our employees to tell us how they feel, we don't share with them the results, we don't do anything with the data, we shouldn't bother. Survey employees and then follow through by acting on the data. So, to go back to the key takeaways, I'll get them all here. Engagement drives performance. I hope I've showed you that. I don't expect you to remember any of the numbers, but I do want you to walk away with the feeling that there is enormous research results that show that engagement drives performance. Engagement is about that personal connection, the head and the heart between the work that I do and the mission of the organization. We need to try to create a culture of engagement, part of the DNA. This is how we do business in this place. This is how we interact with each other. This is how we respect each other. This is how we treat each other. And then the HR role. I haven't talked too much about this, but we in the HR community, we need to be champions. We need to be able to communicate the value of employee engagement to senior leadership as well as our frontline employees. We need to understand the business case. We need to be able to facilitate the process, whether that's the survey process, the data analysis process, or the action planning process. And perhaps most important, we need to be role models. At the university, when we decided to conduct an employee engagement survey, we piloted it in the Office of Human Resources first. And we did that for a couple of reasons. First of all, we wanted to work any kinks out of the process. But secondly, we wanted to demonstrate to the rest of the campus that we were willing to do this first. And then we shared the results with everyone, which was kind of scary, but it worked out okay. But to demonstrate to them that this is something that we were going to go through before we asked them to do it. So those are some of the key takeaways. Some contact information. I know we're just about at the end of time.
To the minute.
I know, and I hope I haven't gone through this stuff too fast. I understand the conference organizers will make the information available to you. As I said at the beginning, I hope there's something in here that will help you, if you're already on the way to improved engagement, move down that path. If you haven't started yet, I hope there's been some convincing information here that will help you get started. I really believe in this stuff, and I believe this is an important way for us in the public sector to improve our performance. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Roger.
Yeah. That concludes the presentation. We're right on time. Russ wants us across the hall for closing. But before we conclude, I just want to say that we hope this has been helpful to you. There's a lot of information, very condensed. We do have access, and we can engage Bob. And these would be the numbers that.
Pun intended.
No pun intended. And we'd be happy to talk with any of you about where you are with your employee engagement challenges. So with that, we'd like to thank Bob certainly for the presentation today, but also for enduring that ordeal yesterday. And we really appreciate it. Thank you.